Zoe Millington woke with a jolt, her heart pounding, hands shaking, and her mind racing with fear. The sharp morning light stabbed at her eyes, making the deep headache at her temples throb even more intensely. A wave of nausea rolled through her, and her mouth was dry, tasting of the aftermath of alcohol. Her stomach twisted, and she groaned, pressing her fingers against her forehead. She felt sweat on her skin and a strange softness beneath her. Sheets that smelled like fresh linen. But this was not her bed. Panic gripped her as she took in her surroundings. The room was massive, with sleek modern furniture, marble flooring, and towering glass windows that let in the golden glow of the rising sun. Gold accents shimmered in the morning light, and the air carried a faint scent of cologne and fresh coffee. It all felt surreal, like she had stepped into someone else's life. She tried to move, but her entire body ached. Her muscles protested as she forced herself to sit up, the room spinning around her. She swallowed hard, struggling to piece together what had happened the night before. Where am I? Her breath hitched as she turned her gaze to the large mirror on the wall. The reflection staring back at her was a mess. Her dark brown skin was slightly damp with sweat, her usually flawless curls were tangled, and her eyeliner was smudged beneath her tired eyes. Her burgundy dress from last night was wrinkled, and her heels were nowhere to be found. Just then, a faint sound from outside the bedroom made her stiffen. Her heart pounded harder as she realized she wasn't alone. The muffled footsteps grew closer, steady and unhurried. She clutched the sheets tighter around her body as the door swung open. A tall man stood in the doorway, his sharp blue eyes studying her carefully. He had a strong jawline, short dark brown hair, and an undeniable air of confidence. His presence dominated the space, but there was something calm about him. He was dressed casually, but everything about him screamed wealth. The perfectly tailored t-shirt, the designer watch on his wrist, the effortless way he carried himself. He walked in slowly, holding a steaming mug in his hand. "You're awake," he said, his voice deep and even. "I brought you some tea. I figured you'd have a brutal hangover." Zoe swallowed, her throat dry. Who are you? What's going on?" Her voice was hoarse, a mix of fear and confusion. He set the mug on a small table near the bed and leaned against the chair beside it. "I'm Nate Patton. You're safe here, I promise." His tone was gentle but firm. "You don't remember much, do you?" Zoe searched her foggy memory. Flashes of loud music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses filled her mind. The wedding reception. Her best friend had convinced her to take a shot, then another. There had been dancing, so much dancing. But after that, things became blurry. "I remember the wedding, and drinking, but nothing after that," she admitted, her voice small. Nate nodded, his expression understanding. "You were outside the hotel after the wedding celebration. It was late. I saw you sitting on the steps, barely able to keep your head up. You were alone, and it was obvious you couldn't get home by yourself. I couldn't leave you like that, so I had my driver bring you here. You passed out on the way." Zoe's stomach twisted with a mixture of relief and mortification. "So nothing happened between us?" she asked hesitantly, shame burning in her cheeks. "Nothing happened," Nate assured her, holding her gaze. "You were in no state to give consent for anything, and I would never take advantage of that. You slept. That's all." Zoe exhaled, a shaky breath of relief. Despite her initial fear, there was no threat in his voice, only sincerity. She reached for the tea, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. As she took a sip, the peppermint eased the queasiness in her stomach. The morning sun bathed the room in golden light, revealing the stunning cityscape beyond the penthouse windows. Tall buildings stretched toward the sky, and the hum of traffic buzzed faintly from below. "Why did you help me?" she asked after a moment, her voice still unsteady. Nate leaned back in his chair, studying her with a calm intensity. "I've had my fair share of wild nights. I know how it feels to be lost, vulnerable. I wouldn't want anyone to be left alone like that." Zoe looked at him carefully, noticing the depth in his expression. He was a man who had seen things, who carried experiences beyond his wealth and polished exterior. Her stomach growled loudly, cutting through the tension. She winced, embarrassed, but Nate only chuckled. "Come on, let's get you some food," he said with a smirk. "You'll feel better." She hesitated for a moment. Should she trust this stranger? Should she just leave and forget this ever happened? But something about him, the way he had been gentle, the way he spoke with quiet sincerity, made her stay. "Okay," she murmured. Nate led her into a stunning dining area where a breakfast spread awaited: fresh fruit, scrambled eggs, toast, and a pot of coffee. As she sat down, she still had a million questions, but for now, one thing was certain. This was going to be a morning she would never forget. Suddenly, a little girl came running into the kitchen and jumped into the seat next to Zoe. "Hey, pretty lady, are you feeling better today?" Zoe gave her a warm smile. "Hi, my name is Zoe. What's yours?" "My name is Jenny Patton, and that's my dad, Nate Patton. Nice to meet you. Daddy said you weren't feeling well and needed help." Zoe laughed. "Your dad is a smart man, and I'm very grateful for his help." Jenny beamed. "How long can you stay? I'm having a tea party with my dad at 10 a.m., and I'd like to invite you." Zoe chuckled. "That sounds wonderful, but I don't think my clothes are very tea party appropriate." Jenny waved a hand dismissively. "That's no problem." She grabbed Zoe's hand and pulled her toward another room. "This is my Aunt Carol's room. When she visits, she always leaves plenty of clothes. You can pick something from here." Zoe hesitated at the doorway, feeling like she was intruding. Before she could respond, Nate appeared behind them. "Jenny, let the lady eat first, then you can ask questions." Jenny pouted, looking disappointed, but she nodded and walked back toward the kitchen. Zoe turned to Nate, amusement dancing in her eyes. "You've got quite a persistent little one there." Nate smirked. "You have no idea." They all sat eating breakfast, Jenny bouncing in her seat. Zoe laughed to herself, enjoying the lively energy at the table. When they finished eating, she thanked Nate. Jenny ran off to her room, excitedly grabbing her phone. Moments later, she was on the line with her Aunt Carol, giving her every detail about Zoe and insisting that she needed to stay for the tea party. Aunt Carol agreed with a warm laugh. "Zoe is welcome to anything in my closet. It's not often I have someone else for tea besides her and Nate." Zoe smiled and nodded. "All right, I'll stay. But first, I need to call my family and let them know I'm safe." She stepped aside and dialed her sister, ready to explain everything that had happened after the wedding. Zoe and Jenny chose a floral dress for their tea party. Nate was in his office working while they sat and chatted. Jenny spoke about her mom living across the country with her new husband, and Zoe shared stories about her mom, dad, and sister, and how they met every Sunday for dinner. Jenny's eyes widened with excitement. "Are you going to see them today?" Zoe smiled. "Yes, would you like to come?" Jenny's face lit up with excitement. "Really? Can I please?" Zoe laughed and pulled out her phone, dialing her mom. "Hi, Mom, would you have room for 2 more guests tonight?" Her mother chuckled on the other end. "Of course, sweetheart, bring them along. We'd love to meet them." Zoe grinned. "Great. Now we just need to ask your dad." Jenny jumped off her chair and bolted to her dad's office. "Dad, we're invited to Zoe's family dinner." Nate looked up from his work, taken aback. "I don't think we should impose, sweetheart." Zoe appeared in the doorway, laughing. "You saved me last night, fed me breakfast, and allowed me to have the best tea party I've had in years. Besides, my mother and father are grateful. They'd love to say thank you." Nate hesitated, then finally exhaled with a smirk. All right, we'll go. But only because Jenny looks like she might explode if I say no." Jenny squealed in excitement, and Zoe beamed, knowing this was about to be an evening to remember. That evening, Zoe's mom, Maddie, her dad, Clay, and her sister Tammy were setting up the dinner table when Zoe walked through the door. They all smiled warmly, and Maddie rushed to give her a tight hug. When she saw Nate and Jenny standing behind Zoe, she pulled them both into a welcoming embrace. "Thank you for watching over my baby girl," she said sincerely. Clay stepped forward, giving Nate a firm handshake before offering Jenny a gentler one. "We appreciate you looking out for Zoe," he said, nodding approvingly. Everyone settled at the table, eating with ease and exchanging stories. The conversation flowed effortlessly as they laughed, shared memories, and learned more about each other. Jenny was especially animated, asking Zoe's sister about her favorite things and giggling at Clay's dad jokes. After dinner, Jenny exchanged numbers with Zoe, promising to call her later that week. "You're my new favorite tea party guest," she beamed. Later that night, Nate tucked Jenny into bed. She looked up at him with sleepy but happy eyes. "Thanks, Dad, for today. It's nice having another girl around who likes what I like." Nate smiled, brushing her hair back. "I'm glad you had fun, sweetheart." As he kissed her forehead and turned off the light, he lay in bed himself, staring at the ceiling. He hadn't realized how much he had closed himself off since the divorce. Tonight had felt different, lighter, warmer. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to open his heart again. The next day, Nate was in his office when his phone rang. It was Carol. "So," she started, a playful lilt in her voice, "how was dinner with Zoe's family?" Nate's words flowed effortlessly as he recounted the evening. His tone was light, almost happy. Carol suddenly let out a loud laugh. "Oh, Nate, you're hilarious." "What? What's so funny?" he asked, genuinely confused. "It's not just Jenny who's crazy about Zoe. You are too," she teased. "You've been talking about her for 10 minutes straight. I'm so excited for you." Nate immediately tried to make excuses. "I'm just happy that Jenny found a new friend, that's all." Carol hummed knowingly. "Sure, Nate. Keep telling yourself that." But deep down, Nate knew Carol was right. There was something there, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The next day, Nate tried to focus on work, but found his mind drifting back to Zoe. Frustrated with himself, he finally picked up the phone and called her. "Would you have dinner with Jenny and me tomorrow night?" Zoe sighed. "Sorry, I can't. I have a training class after work." Nate frowned, unable to hide his disappointment. "Oh, I see." But then Zoe added, "I can come tonight if that's all right." Nate's voice instantly lifted. "Tonight is great." Excited, he called Jenny into his office. "Guess what? Zoe's coming for dinner tonight." Jenny squealed and gave her dad a tight hug. "Best day ever." That evening, when Zoe arrived, Jenny ran straight into her arms. Laughing, Zoe lifted her effortlessly and carried her into the kitchen. "Jenny, you're doing too much," Nate scolded lightly. Zoe grinned. "I don't mind. It's great when you know you're loved." Nate stopped, watching them with an unreadable expression. Sight of Zoe and Jenny laughing together, so effortlessly at ease, stirred something deep inside him. Could this be real? Could he have this again? Someone to share his mornings and nights? Someone to build a life with? The thought lingered as he watched them, a warmth spreading through him that he hadn't felt in years. Zoe couldn't ignore it any longer, the way Nate's gaze lingered on her throughout dinner. It wasn't just a casual glance or a fleeting look. No, it was something deeper, something she couldn't quite place. He was quieter than usual, letting Jenny dominate the conversation, which was strange. Normally, he was the one gently nudging Jenny to rein it in when she got too carried away. But tonight, he just sat there, listening, nodding occasionally, his eyes drifting back to Zoe more times than she could count. Jenny, as always, was full of energy, chatting about school and a funny story about herself and best friend at school. But Zoe found herself distracted, sneaking quick looks at Nate, trying to read him. Was something on his mind, or was she imagining things? When dinner wrapped up, Jenny stretched and let out a yawn. "Ugh, I'm exhausted. Zoe, help me to bed?" Zoe chuckled. "Only if it okay with your dad." Jenny rolled her eyes but hooked an arm around Zoe's shoulder dramatically. "It's okay, he loved to take a break from reading me a nighttime story." As she helped Jenny down the hall, Zoe felt Nate's eyes on her again. It sent a shiver down her spine, not one of discomfort but of curiosity. Once Jenny was settled, Zoe walked back into the living room where Nate was still sitting, his fingers drumming lightly on his knee. He looked up as she approached. "Want to sit for a bit?" he asked. She hesitated, then lowered herself onto the couch across from him. "All right, what's up with you? You've been weirdly quiet all night." Nate let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. I wasn't sure if you'd noticed. Oh, I noticed, she teased. You barely said a word. For a moment, he looked at her, the flicker of hesitation in his expression quickly replaced with determination. I was trying to find the right time to ask you something. Zoe tilted her head. And? He exhaled and finally said, Would you go on a date with me? She blinked. That was unexpected. Exciting, but unexpected. A slow smile played on her lips. I'll think about it, she said, standing up. The way his face fell slightly was almost too much. But she let him sit with it as she walked to the door, grabbing her coat and keys. When she slid into her car, she couldn't fight the grin that spread across her face. Pulling out her phone, she typed out a message and hit send. Yes, I would love to go on a date with you. She started the car, the anticipation buzzing in her chest. This was going to be interesting. Nate had been anxious all day. It had been years since he'd gone on a real date, one where he actually cared about making an impression. He told himself it was just dinner. Just Zoe. They'd known each other for a while now, but something about tonight felt different. When he pulled up to her apartment and saw her stepping out the door, he nearly forgot how to breathe. She was stunning. Not that she wasn't always beautiful, but tonight, dressed elegantly with her hair cascading over her shoulders, she looked effortlessly breathtaking. Zoe smirked as she approached the car. You're staring, Nate. He shook himself out of his trance and opened the passenger door for her. Yeah, you look amazing. She slid into the seat, her smile softening. Thank you. The drive to the restaurant was filled with easy conversation. By now, Zoe was used to Nate's guarded nature, but tonight she could tell he was more tense than usual. When they arrived at the upscale restaurant, Nate pulled out her chair. Ever the gentleman, but Zoe noticed the way his fingers tapped lightly against the table, a subtle sign of nerves. She laughed softly. Nate, this isn't our first time meeting. He exhaled, shaking his head with a small smile. Yeah, I know, but for some reason, I'm still nervous. Zoe reached across the table, brushing her fingers against his hand. Then let's make it easy. No pressure. Tell me something about yourself I don't know, like a weird habit or hobby. Nate chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. Okay, I have this thing where I have to organize my bookshelves by color. It drives me crazy if they're out of order. Zoe gasped, feigning shock. You? Mr. Serious? Aesthetic book arranging? I did not see that coming. Nate laughed, finally relaxing. Hey, I like things to be neat. What about you? She grinned. I have to set 3 alarms in the morning, or I won't wake up, and even then I hit snooze at least twice. The conversation flowed from there, effortless and natural. The nerves melted away as they talked about childhood memories, favorite foods, and embarrassing moments. By the time they finished dessert, Nate was no longer thinking about whether the night was going well. He just knew he was happy. When they arrived back at Zoe's place, he walked her to her door. There was a moment of silence, that lingering pause where neither of them wanted the night to end just yet. Zoe tilted her head, her gaze searching his. Tonight was nice. It was, Nate agreed, his voice quieter now. Then, as if pulled by something unseen, he leaned in. Zoe didn't pull away. Their lips met in a kiss that was soft, warm, and filled with something unspoken, something shifting between them. When they pulled apart, Zoe smiled. Well, that changes everything. Nate exhaled, a slow, genuine smile breaking across his face. Yeah, it does. As she stepped inside, her heart pounded in her chest. Nate was opening up, and for the first time, she realized just how much she wanted to be the person he let in. When Nate walked through the front door, he was surprised to see a small figure standing in the dimly lit hallway. Before he could react, Jenny came running toward him, her eyes wide with excitement. Daddy, how was the date? She asked eagerly. Nate blinked in surprise, setting his keys on the entry table. Who told you I was on a date, and why are you not asleep? Jenny grinned, not the least bit guilty. Aunt Carol said you were going out with Zoe, and I couldn't sleep. I was too excited. Nate sighed but couldn't help but smile as he knelt down to her level. And why exactly were you so excited? Jenny giggled, bouncing on her toes. Because I like Zoe. She's fun, and she listens to me, and she doesn't talk to me like I'm a baby. Nate chuckled, ruffling her hair. Yeah, she's pretty great, huh? Jenny nodded enthusiastically. But Daddy, do you like her? He hesitated for a moment before answering, his expression softening. Yes, I like her, probably not as much as you do, though. Jenny waved a tiny hand dismissively. Don't worry, Daddy, you'll get there. Zoe is great. Nate let out a full laugh, shaking his head at his daughter's confidence. Is that so? Jenny nodded, yawning. Yup, you'll see. He scooped her up in his arms, carrying her toward her room. All right, little matchmaker, let's get you to bed before you start planning the wedding. As he tucked her in, Jenny's eyes were already fluttering closed. Good night, Daddy, she murmured. Nate kissed her forehead. Good night, sweetheart. As he turned off the light, he couldn't shake the warmth spreading through his chest. Maybe Jenny was onto something. Maybe, just maybe, Zoe was something special. Zoe had become a regular fixture at Nate's home, seamlessly blending into his and Jenny's life. Whether it was movie nights, baking cookies, or just helping Jenny with schoolwork, she was there. Warm, familiar, and comforting. Jenny adored her, and Nate was realizing more and more just how much he cared about her, too. But after a few weeks, something changed. Zoe became distracted, her mind elsewhere even when she was physically present. She still smiled, still laughed, but Nate could tell something was weighing on her. And the worst part? She wasn't talking to him about it. Doubt crept in. Maybe they were moving too fast. Maybe she was realizing she didn't want this, didn't want them. One night at dinner, his suspicions only grew. Zoe's phone kept lighting up with incoming texts, the screen flashing repeatedly until she finally sighed and turned it off, flipping it face down on the table. Nate watched her closely. What's going on? She looked up, her expression unreadable. It's nothing. Nothing. That single word felt like a wall going up between them. After that night, she started canceling dinner dates. She was always busy, always caught up in something. And Nate, who had spent so long guarding his heart, felt the old fears creeping back in. Finally, he sent her a text. I think we should take some time apart. I need to think about our relationship. The moment he sent it, a weight settled in his chest. But he couldn't keep going like this. Not when he felt like she was slipping away. Not even an hour later, there was a knock at his door. Zoe stood there, her eyes searching his, her breath uneven. I need to know why, Nate. Why are you pulling away? Nate exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Because you've been too busy for us, Zoe. And I get it. Maybe we're too much for you right now. Her brows furrowed. No, it's not that. Then what is it? He asked, frustration creeping into his voice. You're here, but you're not here. You've been distracted for weeks, dodging questions, canceling plans. Zoe took a deep breath. I've been working on a major project at work. It was more demanding than I expected, and... She hesitated, her fingers twisting together. My boss offered me a promotion. Nate stared at her for a moment, the words settling in. That's wonderful. She gave a tight-lipped smile. The job is across the country. His chest tightened. And your boss has been pushing you to take it. She nodded. A silence stretched between them before he finally asked, voice quieter now. Why haven't you accepted the offer? Zoe met his eyes, something unshakable in her expression. Because everyone I love is here. My mom, my dad, Tammy, Jenny. She paused, her voice soft but sure. And you. Nate's breath caught. You love us? Zoe smiled, her eyes shining. Yes, I do. And I'm not ready to give that up. For the first time in weeks, Nate felt the tension leave his body. He stepped forward, cupping her face gently, searching her expression for any trace of hesitation. He found none. Then, without another word, he kissed her. They were real. And for the first time in a long time, Nate was ready to believe in something lasting. Nate pulled back just enough to look into Zoe's eyes, his hands still gently cradling her face. His heart pounded, not with fear this time, but with something far stronger, certainty. I love you too, Zoe, he said softly. The thought that you were pulling away, it terrified me. I didn't know what to do. He let out a small, shaky laugh. But now I know how you feel, and I want a future with you. Before Zoe could respond, a small voice interrupted. "Are you guys kissing?" They turned to see Jenny standing in the hallway, eyes wide with excitement. Before either of them could say anything, she ran toward them, throwing her little arms around both of their legs in a tight hug. Jenny looked up with a bright smile. "Does this mean you're ours forever, Zoe?" Zoe let out a laugh, brushing Jenny's curls back from her face. "I hope so. But we're still learning each other." She shot Nate a teasing look. "I think one of our work assignments should be communication." Nate chuckled. "I'm going to be more open. I kept my heart guarded for so long, it's been hard to express how I feel." Zoe nodded, her fingers lacing through his. "And I'm a single woman who's used to handling my problems on my own. I guess we both have things to work on." Jenny huffed dramatically. "So much talking." She placed her hands on her hips. "Can we have ice cream now that you've kissed and made up?" They both burst into laughter, the tension of the last few weeks melting away. Nate bent down, lifting Jenny into his arms. "All right, kiddo, I guess we can celebrate." Zoe grinned. "I'm definitely in." As they made their way to the kitchen, Zoe felt something shift inside her. Something solid, something real. She had spent so much time being independent, so much time afraid of what it meant to truly belong to someone. But standing here, laughing with Nate and Jenny, she realized she wasn't just falling in love with a man, she was falling in love with a family. And she wasn't ready to give that up for anything. Zoe had just settled into her office when her phone rang. Seeing the school's number, her heart lurched. She answered immediately. "Miss Carter? This is Nurse Davis from Jenny's school. Jenny isn't feeling well. She has a fever and is very lethargic. We've tried calling Mr. Carter, but we can't get a response. You're listed as an emergency contact. Can you come get her?" Zoe didn't hesitate. "I'm on my way." Grabbing her bag, she rushed out the door, barely pausing to let her boss know she had to leave. Within 20 minutes, she was at the school, signing Jenny out. The little girl looked pale and exhausted, her curls damp with sweat. Zoe knelt beside her and brushed her hair back. "Oh, sweet girl," she murmured. "Let's get you home, okay?" Jenny nodded weakly, letting Zoe carry her to the car. As soon as they arrived at Nate's house, Zoe called her mother, Maddie. Within minutes, Maddie arrived with a medical kit ready to help. Together, they got Jenny comfortable, sponging her forehead and making sure she drank fluids. Hours later, Nate rushed through the front door, his face tight with worry. But when he saw the scene before him, he froze. Zoe sat in the rocking chair in Jenny's room, holding the little girl in her arms, gently swaying back and forth. Softly, she sang a lullaby, her voice barely above a whisper. Jenny, half asleep, clung to her like a lifeline. Nate felt something stir in his chest, something deep and undeniable. Maddie walked up beside him, watching the same scene. "What do you see when you look at them together?" she asked softly. Nate swallowed hard before answering. "My world, my love, my daughter, my wife, my family." Maddie smiled knowingly and squeezed his shoulder. "Goodbye, sweetheart," she whispered before slipping out of the house. That night, Zoe never left Jenny's side. She curled up next to her in bed, keeping a cool cloth on her forehead and whispering reassurances even as the child slept. By morning, Jenny's fever had broken. Zoe woke to find the little girl propped up against pillows, watching cartoons with a sleepy smile. "Hey, you're looking better," Zoe said, brushing a hand over her forehead. Jenny grinned. "I feel better." Just then, Nate walked in, his eyes warm with emotion. He sat on the bed beside them, his gaze locked on Zoe. He took her hand in his, holding it for a long time before finally speaking. "Will you marry me?" Zoe's breath caught. Her eyes widened as tears filled them. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Instead, she simply nodded, her body trembling with emotion. Tears spilled down her cheeks as Nate smiled, pulling her into a soft kiss. Jenny, who had been watching intently, grinned. "Does this mean I can call you Mom now?" Zoe let out a watery laugh, pulling Jenny into a tight hug. "Yes, sweetheart. I would love that." Nate reached over and wrapped them both in his arms, his family. The family he never thought he'd have again. By lunchtime, Zoe still had tears flowing every time she thought about what her life had become. Every time she looked at Nate and Jenny, love overwhelmed her. Jenny, with her usual bluntness, looked at her dad. "Daddy, is she ever going to stop crying?" Nate chuckled, brushing a tear from Zoe's cheek. "It's okay, sweetheart. They're happy tears." At that moment, the front door burst open, and Aunt Carol came rushing in, nearly knocking Zoe over with a hug. "I have a sister now," she cried, squeezing Zoe tightly. Both women were now in tears, which set Jenny off again. Nate raised an eyebrow. "Sweetheart, why are you crying?" Jenny sniffled dramatically. "I don't know, Dad. It feels like the right thing to do." With a laugh, Nate pulled his daughter into another hug, his heart full in a way he never thought possible. His family was complete. The following Sunday, everyone gathered at Zoe's parents' home for their traditional Sunday dinner. It was one of those perfect afternoons, clear skies, a gentle breeze, and the scent of grilled food filling the air. The long wooden table was set outside beneath the large oak tree, draped in a white tablecloth with fresh flowers as the centerpiece. The atmosphere buzzed with laughter, conversation, and the comforting warmth of family. Zoe looked around at the people she loved, her parents, her sister Tammy, Aunt Carol, Maddie, and, of course, Nate and Jenny, who had become such an integral part of her life. It felt like home. It was home. As everyone settled into their seats, Nate stood up, clearing his throat. "Before we eat, I have an announcement." Zoe turned to him, curiosity flickering in her eyes. Then, right there in front of their family, Nate dropped to one knee. A collective gasp rippled through the table. Zoe's hands flew to her mouth as her heart pounded. "I know I already asked you once, but this time I wanted to do it properly," Nate said, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. He opened it, revealing a stunning engagement ring, simple yet elegant, exactly Zoe's style. His voice was steady, but his eyes held a depth of emotion that sent warmth spreading through her chest. "Zoe, from the moment you walked into my life, you changed everything. You've made me believe in love again, in family, in forever. I don't want to spend another day without knowing you'll always be by my side. So will you marry me?" Tears welled up in Zoe's eyes, and she nodded before she could even find the words. "Yes, of course, yes." The second the words left her lips, the backyard erupted in cheers. Jenny jumped up and down, clapping her hands. "She said yes, again!" Tammy and Aunt Carol were already crying. Maddie had a proud smile on her face as she squeezed Zoe's father's hand. Nate slid the ring onto Zoe's finger, then stood, pulling her into a kiss. Laughter and applause surrounded them as their family celebrated the love they had found in each other. Jenny tugged on Zoe's dress with an excited grin. "Can I call you Mom officially now?" Zoe knelt down and cupped Jenny's face. "You can call me Mom forever." Jenny threw her arms around Zoe's neck, hugging her tight. After the excitement settled, everyone finally sat down to eat. Stories were shared, drinks were poured, and love filled the air. Zoe's father raised a toast, welcoming Nate and Jenny into the family. Not that they weren't already family in their hearts. Underneath a golden sunset, Nate and Zoe stood at the altar in an intimate yet beautiful ceremony. The venue was a charming garden with twinkling fairy lights strung across the trees. White roses lined the aisle, and Jenny stood proudly as the flower girl, tossing petals with the biggest grin on her face. Zoe looked breathtaking in her ivory lace gown, her eyes shining with happiness as she held onto her father's arm. Nate stood waiting at the altar, his heart racing as he watched her walk toward him. When she finally reached him, he took her hands in his, squeezing them gently. "I told you I wanted a future with you," Nate whispered, his voice filled with emotion. Zoe smiled, her eyes glistening. "And I told you I wasn't ready to give this up." With vows spoken straight from their hearts, they promised to love each other through every moment, big or small, easy or difficult. When the officiant finally announced, "You may kiss the bride," Nate pulled Zoe into his arms and kissed her deeply, sealing their forever. Jenny jumped up and down. "They did it!" she cheered. The reception was filled with laughter, dancing, and joyful tears. Aunt Carol made a heartfelt speech about gaining a sister, and Tammy gave a hilarious yet sweet toast about Zoe finally finding someone who could keep up with her. By the end of the night, as Zoe and Nate swayed under the stars for their first dance, Jenny curled up on a chair nearby, her eyes heavy with sleep. Nate kissed Zoe's forehead. "We did it," he murmured. Zoe leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "We sure did." And as the music played softly in the background, surrounded by family, love, and a future they had built together, Zoe knew this was exactly where she was meant to be. The end. Hope you enjoyed this wonderful love story by Green Tea Tales. Help our channel to grow by like, share, comments, and subscribe.